Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you have a great lunch. We are going to continue with today's technical conference on the topic at hand, which is Initiative Prioritization, Infrastructure Activities, Compliance with National Codes and Standards. Mr. Camacho, you can go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Sacaron. We wanted to follow up with Mr. Hurtado, and let's give us a perspective of what we're trying to do here. At this point of the questioning, we are gauging the soundness of your prioritization methodology. That's what we're doing at this time. And on that context, if we can refer to PREP 003, that is about the prioritization matrix. So if we can go to 003, page 2.
I'm sorry, Mr. Camacho. I thought I heard Attorney Mercado. Attorney Mercado, do you have any housekeeping matters at this point before we proceed?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Zacaron. We have two clarifications with leave from the Bureau representatives. LUMA representatives would like to clarify two separate matters that were discussed early in the morning, and we request leave to do that for the clarity of the record.
Yes, sure. Please proceed.
So the first clarification is by Don Cortez.
Yes, good afternoon. At approximately 12:24 p.m. today, I was discussing non-technical losses and referred to 7.5% of non-technical losses. As per page 122 of the initial budget, February 24th filing document, document ID NEPR-MI-2020-0019, specifically in the loss recovery program brief, it is 4.5% of non-technical losses, not 7.5%. 7.5% are the technical losses. In addition, I would like to add that these losses are based on estimates because there is not sufficient metering on the GENCO legacy to really provide accurate numbers.
I'm Ashley England, Director of Regulatory. In addition, at 11:50 a.m., in response to a question from Mr. Schiffman, I was unable to add up the total spending in fiscal year 2022 with respect to the financial controls, systems, and management programs. That total is, and I think I quoted between 5 and 10 million. The total for all three programs in fiscal year 2022 is $5.6 million.
Thank you, Ms. Zacaron. Those are the two clarifications for the record.
Thank you, Attorney Mercado. Mr. Camacho, please, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. So yeah, if we can refer to PREP 003, page 2, and under methodology, I think there's a section that is titled methodology, and this is in regards to the prioritization matrix.
This is Attorney Mercado for the record. Mr. Camacho, to be clear, are you referring to attachment 1 to the response or to the response itself?
The response itself.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm sorry, Mr. Camacho, can you tell me again where you are?
Yeah, this is 003, the response, page 2.
Okay.
So we believe there is a section called methodology, and LUMA explaining that utilities usually improve incrementally, whereas LUMA has been tasked with making foundational improvements across the T&D and organization to make up for decades of neglect and deterioration. Can you contrast those two concepts?
Thanks for your question, Mr. Camacho. Sure. So I think what we're trying to communicate here is that the OMA and the board have recognized that today PREPA, or the utility serving Puerto Rico, is not in an acceptable shape or even at a minimum level. And many of the programs or many of the goals that are being set for the sector, if one were starting from a median level utility, could be reached incrementally over a reasonable period of time, or even at an accelerated basis. But that LUMA's task is to remediate, fix quickly the largest risk areas, address those, and set the foundational investments to be able to attain a lot of these transformational changes that are embodied in public policy. So I think that's the concept that in that paragraph.
Thank you. And then to follow with Mr. Cortez, and this is the issue of the restoration, either something that has been tagged as an SRP initiative versus something that could be more of the recovery and transformation. We just want to be clear. Any kind of restoration activity that you will be performing on the island, they will be meeting codes and standards. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Camacho. This is Don Cortez. They are in accordance with FEMA's consensus-based codes, specifications, and standards for public assistance interim policy. 104-009-11 version 2.1 Appendix A. They will also we will use the latest applicable ASCE, IEEE, IEC, NESC, NFPA, and RUS codes and standards. We will also use the Puerto Rico building codes for the design of substation control buildings and enclosures.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me go ahead and follow up on something that you mentioned. The term consensus-based standards. And that term has been repeated multiple times. We want to get a little bit of clarity of what that means. We're going to be referring to some of the SOWs for the restoration work, and that's being used there also. So, you know, the National Electrical Safety Code, NCC2, is defined as a consensus standard. You know, I was part of the development of the latest revision, and I went to the IEEE in New Jersey and I voted. So when you use the term consensus-based standard, are you referring to the implementation of codes like the NCC2 or the NEC, or are you referring to achieving consensus between stakeholders in Puerto Rico outside what the safety codes may require?
Yeah, this is Mario Hurtado, Mr. Camacho. I think, and I'll let my colleagues answer, I think that my first reaction is that consensus-based standard in this context refers to a FEMA requirement for how recovery is done. And I don't know if Mr. Montz maybe can address that definition that FEMA uses, because I think that's the place, at least that I've seen it utilized. Mr. Montz? Let's see if he should be on. If you're on, you're on mute.
Sorry. Christian Montz from IEM. The consensus-based standards, they're from FEMA. As you can imagine, all across the country, there's all kinds of codes and standards in state and local governments. And FEMA has published a guide that provides a listing of all of the codes and standards that would be acceptable to FEMA. And some of those codes and standards, obviously, as part of the VBA of 2018, may actually lift the ability to spend more on a particular piece of infrastructure if you follow that consensus-based codes and standards on FEMA's list. So Mr. Hurtado is right. It's really part of a programmatic discussion.
So the list is comprised of consensus-based standards. It's not that there was consensus to come up with the list.
This is Mario Hurtado. So my understanding is that, you know, that's a term that FEMA utilized to describe a set of standards that they want to be used as a minimum, and they describe them as standards that are based on consensus, whatever that means.
But that's what we're trying to find out. What them.
Well, I think. Well, that's what I'm trying to explain. They think they list them, and they're trying to say those are the minimum standards that they think for. And this term, consensus-based standards, does not apply only to electric utilities. They've used that for lots of different recovery programs. So they use that as sort of as the minimum that they see in the industry that would apply to recovery efforts. And higher standards can be used. And in particular, if there's a particular standard for a particular situation, you can apply a higher standard. I think Mr. Cortez is going to say something.
The technical industry standards are really explained as consensus-based. It has nothing to do with local stakeholders. Stakeholders as an industry, but not local stakeholders.
Thank you very much. That was very useful. So I'm going to go into two different areas. We already spoke about public safety. And again, the context is to gauge the soundness of the prioritization methodology. So can you describe the proposed top SRP initiatives, not programs, that will have the highest impact on improving system stability?
Sure. I'm going to let my colleague answer that.
This is Attorney Margarita Mercado for the record. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say for the record that the details of the initiatives that were filed with the Bureau in response to the request for information were filed confidentially. I just want to give the Bureau a framework that those details are confidential and we can answer questions as LUMA representatives, but the details of that should be addressed separately in an executive session.
Okay, Mr. Camacho, I'm going to start first by just kind of talking through like a high-level strategy, and then Mr. Wilbers can explain some of the initiatives. But at first, from a strategy basis, we're looking at things like flooded substations, items that in our experience will take a long time to restore if they are affected by a hurricane. The second one is what we would consider imminent failures. And the third would be safety issues. Now, these are not 1, 2, 3. This is like they're all the top priority. Okay, so I'm going to let Daryl explain some of the initiatives.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Mr. Camacho. It's Daryl Wilbers, LUMA. I just like to add a few things, a few initiatives that we're looking at. And it might not be explicitly mentioned in the program briefs, but some of the things we're talking about, especially on the transmission line system, where on the 230 kV, where stability is potentially an issue. We're looking at installing anti-cascading structures and that to provide a more robust system. The other items we're looking at is 230 kV single pole trip reclose. These are additional equipment that not additional equipment, different equipment in terms of the 230 kV breakers that would allow more stable operation of the system and only trip for single line of ground faults, which are the most common faults on the system, as opposed to tripping three-phase. So that's another area we're looking at. We're also looking at on the 38 kV and the 115 kV system, adding auto-sectionalizing and hybrid auto-sectionalizing schemes to provide further resiliency. And while it may not affect overall stability of the system, because it usually it's a 230 kV phenomena, where it applies to is maybe on the 115 close to generation, and that it could certainly have an impact on that type of initiative. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. And now, if I got you, on the line, maybe you can tell us a little bit about those initiatives that will have the highest impact on improving system reliability.
System reliability. I guess when we talk about, let me talk about the distribution system first, because we did talk about the distribution automation initiatives and that installing reclosers, installing fusing. I'd have to say that that is the top initiative on the distribution side that will affect reliability. On the transmission side, again, I mentioned some of the initiatives while we call it stability, but it is also reliability based. Any improvements to the 230 kV, the 115 kV, and the 38 kV is going to improve reliability. Particularly, what we've been finding is the 38 kV, we have poor reliability, and we've seen that in the distribution data where there's many of the outage data is the result of transmission faults. So that will be a key area in terms of improving the reliability of the substations, as Dawn had mentioned, as well as improving line reliability on the 38 kV system by either installing breakers or the auto sectionalizing schemes that I've been talking about.
Right. So let me dig a little bit into distribution automation. So will distribution automation be considered an SRP activity?
Distribution automation is not an SRP activity.
Okay. So what will be that top SRP activity that will have the highest impact on improving system reliability? What SRP?
Mr. Camacho, this is Don Cortez. I would say that the biggest single item would be the EMS replacement, because it impacts basically the entire grid. And along with the EMS, it's all the associated items like the telecom systems associated with the EMS. So if I were to point to one, I would say that's one of the very, very top important ones. Not that transmission lines, distribution work, and substations are not important, but if I had to point to one, that'd probably be the one I would point to.
Got it. So now that I got you on the line, Mr. Cortez, so we're going to go into specific distribution system characteristics that they don't need to be considered for remediation. However, what we're looking for is maybe if they're not considered for remediation, what are those investments that are part of the SRP that will support that distribution system characteristic. So for example, can you describe a specific SRP distribution system programs that will address the distribution voltage standardization?
Yes, we have, when we are doing distribution line rebuilds, which is part of an SRP item, as we're rebuilding some lines, we will probably encounter some areas that have multiple voltages. And what we're going to be looking when we're planning to convert that area or to rebuild that line, we will look to see, can we standardize on a particular voltage? Okay. And I believe that you were referring to the voltages.
That is correct. Well, can you confirm? And then we're going to stay at a high level without getting into specifics. But if there is a voltage conversion program, part of the SRP initiatives being proposed?
Give me a second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I can answer that. We do have voltage conversion. Oh, sorry, it's Daryl Wolvers, Luma. We do have voltage conversion as a program, as an initiative, and we do know that it tends to be quite an expensive option. However, we do feel that there are places where it's going to be very beneficial from a loss standpoint. We're also looking at, there are some voltages such as the 8.3 kV and the 7.6 kV, certain voltages that from a sparing standpoint that we would want to convert to 13.2. So we are looking at having a strategy for voltage conversion First starting off at the 8.3 kV, and then eventually moving to the 4160 volt and converting it to 13.2.
So then the voltage conversion program is an SRP initiative. Is that correct?
I think, sorry, this is Mario Hurtado. So the program itself is on, starts on page 82, the brief of the system remediation plan. So my understanding of it is that it's the overall distribution line rebuilt as part of that. In certain cases, there will be voltage conversion. I don't know, and if we need to, we can get back to you on whether that specific component, the voltage conversion itself, is considered part of SRP or not. I think that's it. It sounds like that's your question, and I'm not sure that.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to tell you. The question is, maybe you can provide a little bit more detail later. Just looking the initiatives on the prioritization matrix, that big list. We believe that there's something, without getting into the specifics, that may resemble what we're discussing. And the question was, if it is an SRP initiative, why was it identified as an SRP initiative?
Okay, well, I think we'll have to, if you'll have to, I think give us a couple of minutes to check and then finish. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think on the spreadsheet, the column that is SRP categorization, which I believe is column I, is respect to the program, because the programs were categorized as SRP or not SRP. So you'll notice when you filter for a specific program, all the initiatives are categorized in there. It was pulled over from a program setting, as you can see, since they are consistent with programs and aligned with programs and not necessarily individual initiatives.
All right, Mario, in general, I mean, when we talk about SRP or non-SRP, we focused on programs and whether the program itself was in the system remediation plan or not. Sometimes it relates to initiative. If we're talking about there are specific initiatives that get you to a remediated state, and then there are others in that program that might be beyond that. So sometimes you differentiate it, but when we classified the activities, we focused on whether a program was SRP or not.
I got you. So again, going into the prioritization matrix, so we have an understanding without going into specifics. We understand the program. However, the way we see it is that the initiatives are mapped to the programs. So the initiatives are on column C. We get the programs on column H, and then as Ms. Englund, she's characterizing column I. So it seems like that initiative, not the program, but the initiative that we have been discussing, it seems that it's being classified as an SRP initiative.
The column, it may have been incorrectly labeled, but the program indicates whether that initiative is in an SRP program. So it says SRP categorization, but it is indicative of whether that initiative is within an SRP program. So because it's right next to the program column, it's related to whether the program itself is SRP or not SRP.
Right. So we see it's either SRP or non-SRP, right? Those are the options. And again, we just want to know, it's not a criticism of the classification. We just want to go through the motions of how are you determining this specific initiative to be SRP.
Right, and again, I think the program was deemed to be SRP, and so it was applied to all initiatives, within that program to categorize them as part of that program. But we can look and see if there's a more detailed categorization. But at the moment, it's program level.
One of the things that we want to share is.
Sorry, if I may.
We want to know why there is some description, but something that everybody knows is that having a standard voltage at the distribution level could facilitate restoration after an event. And for example, I don't think we were able to identify that as a justification for that to be either an SRP or not an SRP program. So yeah, just I do not know if you want to tackle that question now, or if you want to respond later, or on writing, or.
So,
Mr. Camacho, I think Mr. Wilbers has a point he'd like to make.
Yeah,
in reference to this.
Thank you. From the information I see, that particular initiative, voltage conversion, is non-SRP.
And again, this is my code. I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind that if it's not in the SRE, doesn't mean it's not important. And it doesn't mean it's not something that we want to carry out or schedule. It just means that program doesn't, or that in this case, this initiative isn't at what was deemed a high risk factor in terms of risk of failure. And so having a large impact on service, safety, or financial impact. So that was the screen.
Well, yeah. We may need. It's not coinciding with what we have. Again, without going into details, Prep 003 attachment 1 under initiatives is listing that program, and then when we look at that categorization, is categorized as an SRP. Now, disregarding this initiative, so when we look at this categorization, should we assume that this categorization is what it says on that column?
So we should, and it categorizes the program in totality. So if a program, you will be able to see in some of the program briefs that certain activities within that program are not SRP. However, the way the categorization worked in this column is that if that program was in the SRP, all of the initiatives under that program were in this column put SRP. However, as we mentioned before, and as I believe presented in the presentation, just one moment, on page 42, programs consist of initiatives that are both SRP and not SRP. So I think it has to do with us classifying, applying the programmatic classification of SRP or not SRP back to all of the initiatives, and we can clarify that in another, in an undertaking. But the column I is referring to the program that is in the column right prior to that, whether that program is SRP or not. So it was applied to all of the initiatives, but it was based on whether the program itself was an SRP or not SRP, and not specifically that initiative.
I think we got it. So what you're saying is that the categorization should resemble what the program is. Okay, so can we do the following? And this will be a request. So we get the program, but for the initiatives, can we get the categorization per initiative?
So we categorize based on programs, and so that column should say program categorization.
Can you categorize initiative? Can you do that mapping?
Pardon?
Can you categorize initiative also?
I would have to go back and see if we could undertake that.
You don't know if an initiative is SRP or non-SRP? That's what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to see if your we're trying to gauge the soundness of the prioritization by initiative, not by program.
We can go back and take a look. And, no.
That doesn't sound when.
I mean, this is Mario Hurtado. I mean, I think the issue, Mr. Camacho, we're glad to look at it, but fundamentally, we did the prioritization. We did the prioritization based on program. We didn't do it based on initiative. So if you wanted us to do a prioritization based on initiative, that would be different work than what we did.
Yeah, we would like to see the categorization by initiative. So is somehow this is something that on your prioritization matrix, this is something that you need to know, and we should be able. You see, right now the way this reads, and I tell you, is reading that program, voltage conversion program, is going to be part of the SRP that you are seeking to be approved by the PREP. That's the way it's been read. But now what we're hearing is, well, that really is not part of the SRP.
So we're happy to go back and we'll try to satisfy your request. We'll look at it. We'll try to satisfy it. The program is distribution line rebuild. And the description of the program, it goes through what the different steps are. And I think in particular, the remediation part of that is attacking the zeros and the ones that are identified in the inspection program. So there are other aspects of that program, again, that are not SRP, but we'll go back and, check in particular whether this one initiative is, whether we could call it SRP or not, and then look at a categorization of the 600 initiatives into whether they're SRP or not. That part of, again, we're not totally sure if we can do that, but we'll endeavor to look at it and give you an answer.
Yeah, so we look forward to that. As you can see, our line of questioning has been about the initiative and not the program. So we're trying to get more granular, and we are trying, again, we're trying to gauge the soundness of your prioritization per initiative. So we look forward to that information. So moving to another topic, to move this along, let's go to RFI Prep 0016, please. Because this line of questions will probe the responses found in that submission.
Okay.
And just to confirm, we do not believe that 0016 is confidential. Is that correct?
16?
Yeah, 16.
16.
Yes. Yes. 16, response 16 has been filed publicly.
All right. So let's give a little bit of context in regards to this response. You submit monthly reports that you copy the PREP. So on your October report that was filed with the PREP on the 12th of November, under the section risks with potential to materially impact project success, it reflects that LUMA, and this is the reflection under that section, LUMA's concerned with a potential disconnect between PREPA's 10-year plan and the SRP that can create a potential for duplication of effort and potential rework. A week later, on November 20th, the PREP issued an order directing PREP and LUMA to immediately coordinate those efforts. So going to your response on 0016 that deals with the 10-year infrastructure plan and the SRP, you state that LUMA and PREPA, it is stated on the response that LUMA and PREPA are aligned in regards to the identification and prioritization of projects included in the March 31st, 2021 PREPA submission in NEPR-MI-2020-0019. Does that seem like a good capture? Okay. All right. So then on May 4, 2021, PREPA submitted SOWs in that docket that you referred to. And those SOWs were provided to Core 3 and FEMA in response to the DR 4339 public assistance funding. The purpose of this line of questioning is to see how that works, how those SOWs are aligned. So on that, there are numerous proposals on that filing by PREPA that pertain to T&D. I'm going to mention three. There's the transmission line 5400 that goes from Punta Lima to Vieques to Culebra. There's a work for the Culebra substation 3801. And there's also a work for transmission line 51300 from Ponce TC to Costa Sur. Those SOWs, part of that submission, were dated December 7, 2020. Can you describe if you plan to change the proposed project scope, and or cost estimates of these three SOWs mentioned that pertain to T&D.
Thank you for your question. I'm going to let Mr. Wilbers answer that question.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Camacho. It's Gerald Wolfers, Lima. No, we're not changing any of the scope estimates that were provided to the prep from PREPA. 5400, 3801, and 51300. What we're doing is the SRP items that would have been tackled under that program, they will be accounted for during the A&E design. We're going to be undertaking detailed design on every structure. Any SRP items that would fall out of that project work will get covered off. So it's no duplication of effort and no extra work that we're going to have to undertake.
So you are aligned with what they're proposing. The question is, the SOWs are dated 12/7, and you raise concerns about lack of coordination. These proposals seem to be aligned with your philosophy.
Yeah, just to be clear, we were aligned. We're aligned with the project need and the identification. The actual scoping details were not completed actually until months later. So when we say we were aligned at that point in time, we were aligned with the project need and why it was on the list. Like I said, the scope we just in fact actually we just finalized some of the scope on 5400. I'd have to say maybe a month or so ago.
So why are you aligned with the restoration of 5400 from Punta Lima to Vieques to Culebra? Why is that important?
Why is that important? Just
instead of choosing another effort across the island, that one was chosen to be pushed at this time. What is the pressing need to get that done?
Well, my understanding, and in discussions with PREPA and having discussions with DOE, the need for improving the resilience of 5400 was critical for Vieques Culebra, given the fact that we're approaching storm season. So any work that we could do in advance. So we were actually already having discussions, knowing that we're probably not going to be able to actually improve the line upgrades or complete the line work, is do that rehabilitation and do that critical SRP identification and repair. That's our understanding from discussions with PREPA, the importance of that infrastructure.
And I'm going to mention last three, and the SOs for these ones were dated February 2nd, 2021. And Mr. Wilbur, what we're looking for is the reasoning for why this is important to move forward at this stage. And if you plan to change the proposed project scope or cost estimates. This is the one, the transmission, the San Juan 115 kV underground transmission loop, the Lloren Torres substation 1106, and Centro Médico 38 kV 416 kV substation 1327 and 1359 for the repair and replacement of that equipment.
And your question is are we aligned, and do we feel the need of proceeding with those projects you mentioned?
So let's go by steps. So first of all, describe if you plan to change these proposed projects, project scope and or cost estimates.
So this is Mario Hurtado. Just to clarify, so their initial scope of works for each of these that were submitted, that's in order for the architecture and engineering firms that are participating in the program to actually do the engineering. In the process of that engineering, my understanding, I mean, they will get more specific. They will make adjustments to the scope because it will be a lot more specific. And likely the estimates for the total amount of work to be done will also get changed because they'll be based on specific engineering. So I just wanted to clarify what stage we're talking about in the process. It's the initial scope of work that's based on really just conceptual design or conceptual discussion before actual engineering takes place. Sorry, go ahead.
So, yeah, thank you, Mario. Yeah, that's correct. I know specifically on the two, I was in discussions with San Juan on the need. We were, again, it was identified from PREPA to us the critical importance of that 115 kV underground loop. Operationally, it was identified. So we understood it. It made sense to us, even though we weren't directly involved in the A&E design that was being undertaken. As for Central Medical, and that we've had numerous discussions on the project, on the alignment of the project need. We agreed the importance of that project, and now we're actually undertaking the scoping definition of that project, and that's underway right now. As for Rio Torres, I'm not quite familiar with Rio Torres, so I'd have to check into that.
So again, gauging the priorities. Please go ahead.
All right, Mr. Martin. This is Dr. Cortez. When we reviewed the projects, we believe that the projects are important. They're important on our list as well. What we initially had a problem with was the sequence of the projects, not necessarily the scoping and the sequence of the projects. So when we talk about alignment with PREPA, we then talk about alignment on the prioritization or sequence of the projects, and on the first batch of projects where we gained alignment on the scope, which was based on our priorities for work. If that helps with what you were trying to find out.
So do you agree with this prioritization of work?
At this point, we agree with the prioritization of work, because when we go through and we look at it, we have now synchronized the sequence of works.
And you agree on that prioritization due to the impact that these projects will have on the stability of the system? Can you provide a little bit of detail of what will be the outcome? I'm going to throw one. The equipment replacement of Centro Medico, substation 1327 and 1359. What is the reason for that to be priority?
Thank you again, Mr. Camacho. It's Daryl. The reason that I was told was that it feeds a number of hospitals in that area. It's a very critical substation that is in very poor condition and was in need of distribution improvements, metal class switchgear upgrades. We're also undertaking the need for, I believe it's either 38 kV or 115 kV improvements. We've increased the scope to look at reliability improvements on the primary voltage at that substation. And the underlying reason was that substation is very critical due to all the hospitals in the area. And that was what PREPA was asserting. We'd agreed from our initial review that we saw it, and it makes complete sense. And that was the reason why we carried that project forward.
Yeah, Centro Médico is a premier trauma center in Puerto Rico. So to summarize this section, so we can go to the next section, what we're hearing is that this proposal that we have been discussing now, this is a proposal. It seems like you are going to move forward with that proposal, and it doesn't seem that you're going to be changing the proposal as it stands right now.
Sorry, Mr. Camacho, what proposal are you referring to?
This is what the statement of work, the proposed projects with the statement of works on NEPR the 0002.
You're talking about the ones that were submitted.
The one we're just referring to right now, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've reviewed those. My understanding is we've reviewed those, and they're aligned with LUMA's programs. and we want to move forward with those programs, with those projects, those statements of work, so that they go on to the actual engineering phase and more detailed cost estimates.
Thank you very much for information. So Ms. Acaron, I will turn it to you.
You were muted, Vanessa.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Camacho. I just want to ask commissioners if there are any questions on this topic before we proceed to the next one.
No question.
Not from my part.
Not from my part. Thank you. Then we will continue with the next topic on the agenda, which is emergency preparedness.
Hi, thank you. It's Roger Schiffman again, consultant for the Bureau. Mr. Hurtado, just to begin this, one area where I'd like to hear some more detail is just in, or with respect to the gap analysis that was completed by LUMA. What specific gaps did you uncover with respect specifically to emergency response preparedness, both in terms of process, warehousing, spare parts, fleet, other aspects that you would need. I think as well, we talked in the initial budgets hearing about, backup arrangements and sharing arrangements that you would have as well for bringing in additional resources to the island in the event of a storm event.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shipman. Thank you for that question. This is Mario Hurtado. I'm going to hand it over to our team that's worked more directly on emergency response plan and preparedness, so that they can address your question on sort of our gap analysis and what we found initially relating to emergency preparedness.
Good afternoon, Terry Tonsi here, and thank you for the question, Mr. Shipman. So gap analysis, we conducted a thorough gap analysis, and there's a lot of things we learned. Everything from a lack of understanding of ICS, how the command system works, emergency response plans that were pretty weak at best. We also realized that there was a general theme of people not being prepared. So those combinations of not actually having a plan, having a practice plan, being trained on the plan, really led to us to believe, like this, it caused us to take us where we're at now. Furthermore, back to your questions with fleet. Insufficient fleet is very aged, as like we presented before, and is broke down a lot of times. Material was at that period of time, we heard it was depleted down to about the $30 million mark, and one could argue that what the level of quality of the material it was actually usable to at that time. We also learned during the Maria from various information they provide us that they just didn't have enough mutual aid activated soon enough, and really at the end of the day, they didn't have a good understanding of the total damages until well into the process. And not to point fingers, because it was a really catastrophic event. It took a long time for them to stand up their incident command system, bring the right people in, and start to actually restoring service in a coordinated fashion.
Thank you. So can you, or whoever's appropriate, identify then the specific that are in the SRP to remediate the emergency response, and also what we should anticipate in terms of progress towards remediation each year, I guess, or to the extent there's material progress within a year, sort of what to expect in terms of, where we would be at with preparedness?
Yes, I can definitely answer that. Let me pull up a document here. So really, in essence, it starts with a plan, a framework, and Luma put a lot of effort during this transition period to developing a plan that's fairly robust, and to get us to a state where we can actually understand and everybody understands their role while responding. We identified training. Training's huge. When you begin with any response exercise, you got to make sure people are trained to a certain level, and we've done that. We've done numerous hours of training already. Brought a lot of our employees up to the current employees right now of Luma up to ICS 400 levels, which includes 300, 100, 200, 700, and 800 of the ICS systems, and that's just the start. That begins. We're going to train the rest of the employees once they come Luma, the ones that are currently PREPA today, and they'll go through that same exercise of becoming trained to the level that we need them to get. And that training is the base level. And as we get into the different levels within our EOC structure, some of those individuals will have a lot more training to make sure they're capable and competent to perform at a very high efficient level. Then we have to practice the plan. We got to make sure we're practicing the plan frequently, and make sure people understand their role when an event happens. And that will be an evolution. That'll be years before it's okay to train people. But with anything like this, it takes multiple exercises, multiple training, and people will become more comfortable in the positions they get, so it becomes second nature. Another key principle that we were going to implement that PREPA unfortunately did not have is, what is your role during an emergency? Everybody within Luma will have a role. When a serious incident happens, there can be no idle hands. Everybody has to step up and be trained in a role that can be very proficient. Then, next steps. We want to make sure we've got the proper tools and equipment for our people to be very effective. And what do we mean by that? Well, we want to have enough fleet, and actually fleet that runs, be able to respond very efficiently and effectively. Luma right now, we actually have 30 brand new units on the island right now, and an additional 30 will show up before June 1st. So we're rapidly preparing to get our fleet at a state where it's going to be optimal, so we can respond very quick. And those pieces of machinery are not going to let us down. The other one is tools. Tools. PREPA's struggling to have the right tool for the right job. A lot of it's old, antiquated. So we were actually part of the SRP. We've actually earmarked a dollar value for a large dollar value for tools, and that's everything for every tools that our first responders need, and that is rated tools like insulated tools, rubber goods, hand tools, all those certain things for people to be effective when they're responding to an outage. And actually, to be prepared, once again, because we want to be prepared. That's a good thing to we want to strive for. Is we're day one, we have $4 million tools that will arrive on the island next week to make sure we can kind of stop the gap that what is currently PREPA has today. The other things that are equipment, and I kind of bounce back on equipment a little bit, and is specialized equipment. PREPA lacks specialized equipment to respond into a lot of their terrain, and where their facilities are installed, they are in very limited access. So we have we're purchasing some specialized off-road equipment, that diggers and buckets that can actually get into the backcountry and restore power more effectively versus a guy on the end of a shovel and several guys packing a pole and up in the mountains. And there's just stuff in town even. There's a lot of the backyard access that I know you guys probably heard about. There is no access in some of these backyards. People built their yards around the power line, and we got to get specialized equipment in there to properly respond efficiently during an event. We'll touch on a little bit on warehousing. So, we went to, we seen what PREPA had, and they gave us the list, and we can it was basically an analytical approach from what they're telling us. We're trying to do a more in-depth review of all their stock. But what we believe right now is there's about $140 million of material stock on island. And from our intelligence, at a very rudimentary level, until we get eyes on it and actually see the condition of a lot of the stuff, it will be, we assume in a large event, category 2, it'll probably last us about 2 weeks, 2 months of actually response. So with hopes with there, and not hope, we'll go actually, when that happens, we'll make sure we do a very fast damage assessment, and that way we start ordering material early in the game so that stock does not run out of base level for what we need to respond effectively. The next thing I'll kind of touch on a little bit is technology. We're going to get some technology that's going to help us be a lot more effective. And one of it I'll mention is Web EOC. It's a program I'm sure you guys are aware of. It's for it's basically to manage your EOC. It has all your documents, all your contacts and stuff like that, and it allows you to manage the event a lot easier versus paper and pen. Another IT tool that we need to go and get very quickly is a damage assessment tool, something that's electronic that our guys can go and quickly do an assessment. It uploads, it meets all FEMA requirements for reimbursement, and then we can forward that back to our engineering team, and they can build packages and understand what we need for materials. The other piece under IT, and this is kind of a thing that PREPA really struggles with, unfortunately, is communications. Today, none of their crews have company cell phones or communications.
Please add their name, Marcelo, for the record. Sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Donski. I just want to state for the record that on IT and communications equipment and systems infrastructure, it has been submitted confidentially, so we can provide the Bureau general assessment of the equipment, but the details should be discussed confidentially. You can go ahead and give a general explanation without specificity on the equipment and software or infrastructure that's going to be acquired and purpose assess the current situation.
I'll try to stay high level, so please correct me if I'm going too deep again, but we're going to have some cell phones, so all the crews can communicate back and forth. And receive orders and understand, and just basically be able to dispatch them to the next work. Today's world, like say, everybody has their personal cell phone, so you're depending on somebody else's programs and tools. The other one is we're going to get some technologies into the field that allow these employees to see digital maps, receive work orders digitally, understand the system so they can look at it and they can start integrating versus going blind, what they currently do today. So that'll greatly speed up our response to properly do damage assessments to restoration. I think at that one, I'll continue if everybody's okay with that. We'll touch a little bit on mutual aid because that was the other thing we want to make sure, because you're going to need a mutual aid program. So today, LUMA is seeking 3 mutual aid programs. We actually have one. We're with APPA as an associate member under PREPA's current mutual aid agreement. And what that means is if an event happens, we just have to ask PREPA, and they broadcasted out to APPA. APPA, we've talked to them numerous times, and they're fully supportive that LUMA is underneath PREPA's umbrella, and they're fully supportive for what we need. So, but we will endeavor and try to become basically a member without being an associated member, so we have more autonomy to request resources when we need to. In an event like this, you want to make sure you respond quickly, and you want to make sure you have control.
So, Mr. Jorge Camacho, consultant for the PREP, Mr. Tonsi, really quick. So sorry to interrupt you, but just to get into something that you just said. Can you provide some kind of overview of? We understand PREPA is a member, is an APPA member. So how will the flowchart work in regards to seeking mutual aid? Who's going to be requesting the mutual aid? How the flowchart goes through PREPA to APPA? How does that process is being thought right now?
Thanks for the question, and I'll clarify. Yes, so what we have to do is we have to contact PREPA, and we're still we gotta hammer out all those little fine details, but we gotta contact PREPA, and we get a hold of it's Fernando Bedidra, and he will make the request on our behalf. And then once we understand from APPA, once the door is open, we can communicate back and forth with APPA.
Thank you.
Okay. The other one is we want to make sure we have the ability to connect and be part of, but we're struggling is the EEI, just because it's for investor-owned utilities. But everybody understands that's a big market, that a big resource pool we can pull from. So we're currently working with the EEI right now, and they're working with their lawyers and such to see what they can do for us to be part of their membership as well. It sounds very positive, but once again, we're working through that. Currently, right now, also the last one is CARELIC. That's the Caribbean Utilities Mutual Aid Program. We're just like APPA, we're associate member, but CARELIC also told us this week that they're seeking a way to make us a sole member. So they're working with their lawyers right now to change their framework. So that's the three key ones with mutual aid. The next one.
I am so sorry. So before we go from this topic again, just to get a clear understanding. So the actual request, the one describing the needs, for example, we're going to need 5 auger trucks. We're going to need 3 bucket trucks. Who makes the request? Is it PREP or LUMA?
The way it was explained to us, it will be us, but PREPA will make the first call and open the door for us to allow to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
And generally how that works is there's a call to all the members, and LUMA will actually announce what their need is, and all the rest of those members of the utility, APPA, will basically tell you what they can give up. If it's 10 crews, 20 trucks, and those types of things. So, on-island power line contractors. So we have some contingent power line contracts in place today. There's 7, and that basically accumulates to around 400 personnel we have at our availability. The one thing is kind of interesting on that one that we will do a little bit different than PREPA is we're going to early activate. Well, generally what happens with PREPA, they always wait till there's some sort of declaration before they bring contract personnel to help. So we're going to be able to get those resources coming a lot quicker. So our duration is a lot shorter. Due to this, we were learning as we go. We're actually going to have more. We're going to send another RFP to mainland contract or to the can provide support to us on that also. Off-island contingent power line contractors. With that one there, we're securing PREPA's current contract that they have with Mastec. If I'm allowed to say that, I did. They are, they were signed up with PREPA. And once again, they're a fairly large contractor on the U.S. mainland. So our discussions with MasTec right now is they're saying they can have about 250 personnel and equipment on the island within 14 days. So it's and then there could be more additional resources come after 14 days, but it'll take time for them to get it up and coming our way. One thing I didn't talk about, because I focused on power line contractors, and I know everybody thinks power linemen, but the other one is bench management contractors. So once LUMA gets up and running, we're going to have approximately, we're going to have numerous contract crews performing planned maintenance programs. And those crews can be deployed to meet our needs during an event to help us with removal of down trees, clearing power line right of ways, and actually building access to remote areas. And with that, there's approximately about 400 resources there we can draw from. So, you know, the story I was trying to paint there is we have a lot of horsepower that can come to our aid in the event of a significant incident. The last one I'll talk about is our parent company, as we're talking about resources. So Quanta is once again is one of our mother companies, and ADCO. Both of those companies will also provide resources if we need to. Once again, we want to follow the correct process, make sure we use our mutual aid and other the contingent contracts, but we also have support if the event gets so big, our mother companies will come to our aid as well, which is a really good feeling when you're on a little island.
So with respect to the PREPA contracts that you're talking about, assuming is the idea that those would continue even after the transition, or that LUMA would basically be executing its own agreements to get mutual aid?
Yes, so we assume those contracts, and they'll continue, or that we'll take them over into commencement, and we'll relocate well into the future. We also, on the on-island contracts, we've actually negotiated with 5 and had them under LUMA's contract umbrella.
And so then in terms of, what to expect in terms of remediation progress, what would be the difference, I guess, between if a hurricane hit, within the next 2 weeks, or if it hit, within a month of LUMA taking over operations, and then, similarly, if one hit, in the first, after the first year or after the second year. So given that you did find gaps, presumably it's going to take, even with having these agreements in place, presumably it's going to take some time to get, adequate materials. I know you talked about, you've got $4 million worth of equipment. You've got some trucks that I guess have already been procured. Of, what to expect in terms of the timing of remediation, over really the first 3 years of LUMA operations.
Thank you, Mr. Schiffman. Very good question. Thank you. And I think, for us, what you're going to find even from day one when we take over, is going to be early activation of our plans and making sure we have support coming well in advance before it's months or weeks after the event. So, as you can appreciate, the weather patterns and weather systems or weather network channels can tell us if an event's going to come our way. So we can start doing some data analytics and seeing exactly if it's going to hit the island, and we can start to gauge some of the damages with that. It will also tie into Mr. Cortez's damage assessment tool or damage predicted tools as well. But at the end of the day, you're gonna see LUMA activate a lot quicker, and we're not going to be shy to bring extra resources in, because once again, we want to make sure we're very responsive in a fashion that, we're taking care of the safety of the public, and then restoration of the services as soon as possible. But what you'll see over time from this year to the following years is, the system will become more resilient. We're going to invest a lot of money into the system. We're going to make some fixes of stuff that should have been fixed many, many years ago, and the system will become stronger. So when an event happens, there'll be less damage. And the other side, I guess I'll touch on is our linemen will become, and well, not linemen, but everybody in Luma will become more trained and we're highly skilled, and we're going to bring them to the level of everybody on the mainland. So we're very productive and safer on our response.
Yeah, I understand that at sort of a conceptual level, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is just, as you said, the system's going to get better. So you're going to implement a vegetation management program that's been lacking, which presumably will make the system more resilient to a storm event. You're going to be fixing substations, rebuilding feeders, rebuilding transmission lines, in addition to implementing this process, getting a better both crew training and equipment for the crews. So just trying to get something a little bit more, I don't know if quantitative is the right word, but a little bit more detailed or robust explanation of, if a say category 3 or 4 hurricane hit this year, given the current state of the system as Luma understands it, which I understand is not completely visible, but just how much better will things be again? Not just with respect to emergency preparedness implementation itself, but in terms of the whole integrated, as we talked earlier, sort of the reconstruction and the transformation of the system.
I'm just sorry, Mr. I'm just trying to understand the question and how I can respond to that. Because are you looking for time and duration or effort? Where you like to take you on this?
I would just like to get Luma's expectation for, if a large storm hit this year, is going to be similar situation to Hurricane Maria in terms of the damage and recovery, and as opposed to if a similar storm hit, in 1 year or 2 years, what could we expect in terms of improvement? That's what I'm trying to, and I understand it's not something that's directly quantifiable, but just to try to get some sense of, what progress would be made, assuming that the system remediation plan and the initial budgets are implemented as forecast.
So this is Mario Hurtado. I mean, I think what Mr. Tansi was going through is, a couple of key things just to point out. I think one of the things he emphasized was a quicker reaction for more resources. So if, when there is, we're going to be calling on resources more quickly. So he mentioned the on-island resources that had already been contracted, and because we'll be doing the vegetation management program aggressively, those resources will also largely be on island. So, we will be able to draw on those, and our plan is to draw on those more quickly and not wait until our local crews are overwhelmed or are behind. That will turn into all other things being equal. And again, each storm is going to be different, and it all depends on where it comes and all of those other caveats. That would translate into shorter estimated times for restoration. And so that, one of the differences would be less time in an outage. And then, I think the additional equipment that's been talked about, the tool that have been talked about that are also part of the SRP, and the rolling stock all will help for there to be a faster reaction, and one with workers being safer and the public being safer. So that should cut down on accidents during storms and during restoration, and again, translate into shorter restoration times. Is that, sorry, go ahead. I think Mr. Cortez would like to add something.
From an asset perspective, infrastructure, while we're carrying out the inspections and we find vulnerable facilities, especially those that are hard to get to, we're gonna fix them before the next storm season comes. Hopefully, in this storm season, we can find some, we can reinforce them temporarily, but by the next storm season, we should have them, those that are vulnerable and difficult to get to locations, have them addressed or identified so that we can have less damage in the event of a hurricane.
So, Mr. Cortez, is going back to the inspection process. So, does that mean you would be prioritizing inspection of like remote areas, or you would still be prioritizing based on areas where there's current damage or currently poor performing circuits?
Both. We're going to target the worst performing circuits, and then we're also going to target facilities, especially transmission and transmission facilities that are in hard to get to locations, because those would be the ones that have the most extended outages and would be more difficult to replace or repair.
And then for those types of facilities, tying that to kind of the overall strategy for federal funding, would those be targeted as hazard mitigation type projects?
Those would be part of the FEMA work, which program I'm not too sure of right now. Maybe Christian can answer that. It'll probably be a combination of all the programs that are available to us. 428 and probably the 406 for hardening. Christian, can you elaborate a little bit more? Was that correct?
Sure. For future storms, there would be the ability to charge to Category B costs for emergency protective measures, some debris removal, and any other programs that the president would authorize for a disaster declaration. Typically, all the big public assistance programs that involve structure.
But in terms of project formulation, will that be a formal part of the funding process that LUMA is pursuing, is basically to identify those specific projects? So something that maybe necessarily isn't probably performing right now, but which is
So I think you might be referring to a year-over-year damages where something has not been fixed yet, but perhaps another storm hits it. Is that what you might be referring to, Mr. Schiffman?
No, I'm trying to understand that just again, the integrated nature of the plan is part of the formal process to understand areas that are most vulnerable to future storms, whether or not they were damaged by Maria, and to have that as a formal part of the overall federal funding process.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So as part of our process, we're certainly going to use that as justification, not only for those projects that are targeted, but also for those pieces of infrastructure that we'd like to make more resilient and to add additional 406 funding on it. That will be part of our analysis and part of our benefit cost analysis to FEMA to demonstrate that resilient fund is required and justified.
This is Dr. Chris again. In addition to some of those, we will also, Mr. Wilbers talked about double dead end to prevent cascading outages or cascading power failures. So we'll be strategically placing some of those. And then by next year, I'm sure we'll have fused laterals so that we narrow down the damage. We'll have reclosers, so that will also help narrow down the affected areas.
And that type of equipment is something that you would be proactively installing, Mr. Cortez, to guard against future storms, or that's something that you would be installing, as we talked earlier, just whenever you're rebuilding a circuit?
The strategic placements for cascading, those will be done preventively, that they're ready as many as we can before the next storm season, especially the higher voltage systems. The reclosers we will be placing on those west performing circuits, and we will also be fusing all the longer laterals, starting with the worst performing circuits, because those are the ones that are usually affected the most.
And then going back to just again the emergency response preparedness and the investments that are being made. You talked earlier about $4 million of equipment that's already been ordered. Can you give us some sense about what that equipment is and how that will help with the current hurricane season?
Yes, I can, Mr. Schiffman. This is Terry Fonzie. Bring up the document here. So a lot of that tooling is basically day-to-day tools the linemen need to do their job safely. And that's insulated, rated hot sticks, lifeline tools, rubber goods. They currently today within their lifeline tools, they do not test them. Most all utilities, all according to OSHA, have to test them, and unfortunately, PREPA does not. So we got a lot of old tools that need to be tested, and basically we need to get them basically purchased new so they can do their job. The other part is like ground chains. They don't have sufficient ground chains to safely work on the system. There's fault finding equipment that they currently don't have today that will increase response times to finding the faults. There's stuff that basically helps the linemen do their job more efficient and quicker, and that'd be like your battery operated tools, compression tools. Climbing equipment is another key one. Just climate or fall protection climate equipment that meets OSHA standards. They work more efficiently at the pole and safer at the end of the day. Those are some key items, but when you're talking of the workforce that we're going to have, it doesn't take very long to eat up $4 million.
And then in terms of the cost for that equipment, the cost for the fleet vehicles that you indicate have already been delivered or that are on order, are those part of the initial budgets, or is that something that PREPA is funding as part of a sort of coordination with LUMIT for the front end transition, or help us kind of understand how that part, how those expenditures are being funded?
I'll let Ashley comment on
that. The budgets for both fleet and tools are in the system remediation plan on page 195 as well as on page 202.
Right, but what I'm trying to understand is the timing. It sounds like expenditures have already been made or are in process during the front end transition. So are those something that's accounted for in the front end transition, or are those in the initial budget and they'll somehow be reimbursement?
Good. This is Mario Hurtado. We'll have an undertaking to verify exactly if it's in the front end or exactly how it will work. We definitely it was prudent to go ahead and make some of those now, exactly because of the impending storm season and timing. We took those initial steps. So for example, tools, our whole budget for the year is, I think, about $10 million. Mr. Tanzi talked about spending right now too. I think the vehicles, it's also just the start, but we felt like we needed some, just to be prudent, we needed some initial tools and some initial vehicles in order to be in good shape for the storm season. We didn't want to get caught not having at least the minimum resources we would need to effectively respond. But we'll take an undertaking and respond to your question in terms of how that cost will be accounted for, and in which part of the budgeting.
Understood, and I don't take the question as critical. I'm just trying to clarify and understand how the money is flowing.
I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to take it as critical. We'll figure out and get you an answer.
Right, and just to tie up, Mr. Hurtado, Mr. Tanzi had indicated, backup support services potentially from Quanta Services or even from ATCO. We had, some fairly extensive discussion during the initial budgets technical workshop just about arm's length nature of such support services. So, just for, the benefit of stakeholders who may be on this call and not in that workshop, just to get some description from you about how those types of services would be arranged and in a way that would basically, be arm's length in nature, and that would, not be something that, other potential providers would view as anti-competitive.
Sure. Well, our plan there is to work utilizing several of the mitigation measures we have against the potential organizational conflict of interest. We would, given the time and everything else, we would have a process with involved third parties and some, would be able to show that there was a fair both design of the scope, as well as conducting of the process, and then finally the evaluation of that. Ultimately, we know it's very important to be able to show an arm's length process from a procurement standpoint, and once the event takes place, we need to be able to show the reasonableness of whatever expenses were incurred. In the case of an emergency, one of the things that the logistics section chief in the EOC, which will, the finance and administration section chief in the emergency operations center would have to do is to do the cost benefit analysis of any resources that were ordered during the emergency. So as Mr. Thompson was going through his list, that there would be a drop down of the, you go for what is the most immediate and least expensive first. And you only get to, in the case that we're talking about of using resources from our parents that would be obviously outside of Puerto Rico, that would be something that would get looked at after you've exhausted a lot of resources. But ultimately, that still has to be reasonable, and it still has to meet, in the case of your storm, any FEMA requirements for reimbursement. We are very aware of that, and we'll take all the steps to make sure that that is done correctly, and that it's all reimbursable, and that it's fair to the people of Puerto Rico. That's very important.
Okay, thank you. I think those are all the prepared questions I have on this topic at this time. I'm not sure if the commissioners or Mr. Camacho have any additional questions.
I don't have additional questions on this topic. Thank you, Mr. Schiffman.
This is Commissioner Mateo. This is a general question, but very important. This plan has some work and programs that are related to how you respond and how you prepare to emergencies. I just wanted to confirm that Luma representatives are aware and clear that whatever is in this plan is subject to change, since we have a separate procedure for evaluating the emergency plan that Luma is still pending to submit to the Bureau.
Commissioner Mateo, thank you for your comment. We are obviously aware of the other docket for the emergency response plan. Nevertheless, we are planning to submit to the commission the current draft of the emergency response plan, as well as the 3 annexes, the restoration annex, the earthquake annex, and the fire annex. We plan to have that document to the commission, to the Bureau today. As I mentioned in my testimony last week, we still have a desktop exercise that we're doing as an organization, and would like to incorporate that the final ERP for this season. And so we would want to still make any adjustments for it for then, and then that would be the form under the specific docket for the ERP.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Is Luma working for a similar effort regarding the data security and the physical security plans?
We are working on getting both of those submitted as soon as possible. That we're not planning on submitting those today, but we are working on getting those submitted for those 2 very soon.
Okay, because it's really important that we take care of them as soon as possible, so you can start having a more final version of the SRP, if you will, once we have the results of the evaluation of the other plans. So thank you very much.
Understood, Commissioner. Thank you.
Any additional questions from commissioners or Mr. Camacho? Okay, then we will go ahead into the next topic on the agenda. That is Luma's SRP prioritization, accounting for low criticality.
Thank you very much, Ms. Acaron.
Sorry, it seems like I interrupt you, but it's not on purpose. It's Attorney Margarita Mercado. We were wondering if we could have a recess. I know we're a bit behind in the agenda. It could be a shorter recess within the discussion of the Bureau, but it would be good to have it at this juncture.
Okay, yeah. I didn't start before because I was thinking about the break. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene at 3:53 in order to continue with this new topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Attorney Mercado, are you ready on your end?
Good afternoon. Correct. We are ready to proceed.
Thank you. Then, Mr. Camacho, you can go ahead with the next topic.
Well, thank you very much. This is for Mr. Hurtado. And again, we are trying to gauge your prioritization methodology. On this specific instance, we are going to be talking about specific input of low criticality. But before we get there, can we refer to, let's go to the initial filing on the SRP. And if we can go to figure 1.6, I believe that is on page 27.
Okay.
Okay, so looking at this process, the gap assessment and the recovery and transformation framework are inputs to the process. That's a way to see it.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the gap assessment is an input to the process, or it's the first step in the process. But sure, yeah, either way. And then the recovery and transformation framework is part of the methodology utilized for the prioritization and the sequencing. In other words, it was utilized in order to help through that process.
Okay. So, in the context of that depiction, can you describe the differences between program sequencing and prioritization?
Sure. I think my colleague is going to handle that. Mr. Wood will handle that. Thank you.
Hi, Lee Wood here, Director of Business Transformation. So program prioritization is determining which programs are most, I'll say valuable loosely, in terms of their impact towards our goals. So that's I would say that's probably, if you were to simplify it into a simple linear process, prioritization comes first. Which programs are the most important? And then that second step, or most valuable, the second step is sequencing. Which of those most valuable programs do we do first year, second year, third, and so on. And so it's the sequencing is the determination of annual budgets. Prioritization is that, again, high level assessment of the value of each program towards our goals. So we did prioritization, and that gave us the qualitative indication of how each program impacted our goals. We used that information along with other considerations of logical ordering of operations to then determine the sequencing of those programs.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. So trying to get to specifics, you're talking about impact, about our goals. Can we get more specific? For example, so what were the inputs to determine that impact? Was it non-compliance with codes and standards, imminent safety risk, low criticality, federal funding eligibility? We're trying to identify those inputs that you use in your process to come up to that prioritization determination.
Hi, Mr. Camacho, Mario Hurtado. Yeah, I think what might be helpful here is if we look on Appendix B, the system remediation plan, And again, this is to talk about, to answer your question on prioritization, and how did we look at it. So, you know, we've talked about the goals. I know this commission and this bureau and others have heard us kind of ad nauseum about that now, our 5 different goals. They're not really our goal. We're saying ours because we've used them in this process, but we're operationalizing the goals in public policy that has already been set up for Puerto Rico. We just put it in a way that we could use it to be able to determine certain steps. And so if you look at those detailed goals, and we have below that, we have objectives. And so in the scoring for the different programs, or in determining, as Mr. Wood was talking about, which are more quote unquote valuable or important, we had our teams check whether or not they met these different objectives, or which objectives were met as a primary result of the program, or in other words, directly affected it or indirectly affected these objectives. Some of the things that we also looked at was how they would impact specific performance. So that, you know, just to aid in thinking about that, those are some of the quantitative type measures that might be used depending on the program. You know, are those performance metrics that are listed in the 3rd column. And so, you know, the programs that met, you know, the different goals, we then, as you have the spreadsheet, you've seen kind of how we stacked all of that up. And that was the prioritization. So primarily it has to do with what are the impacts of having these programs, how do they meet the public policy goals that have been established, or how do they meet specific improvements in customer service, like reliability, resiliency, other things like that. The federal funding that you mentioned is sort of built into the system rebuild and resiliency, because restoring damaged grid infrastructure of the system rebuild and resiliency goal. So that's how we made sure that that was a highly valued component, or that meeting those goals was highly valued for in terms of prioritizing our different programs. Obviously, safety was on there, and so on. Whether or not they went into the system remediation program was a later filter that looked specifically at the risk and the impact. So we did prioritization, and we did selection of SRP, and they were not the same process. So some of the things that you were talking about, you know, that have to do with what has the biggest impact, or what has a critical impact, that has to do with the SRP. How does it meet certain public policy goals? How does it improve specific customer service metrics, for example? That's in the prioritization.
Thank you, Mr. Hurtado. So now on that Appendix B, if possible, let's go ahead and explore a section there. The goal, system rebuild and resiliency. On the restore damaged grid infrastructure, you are saying that you want to focus first on critical loads. How do you identify those critical loads?
So yeah, just to be complete, Mr. Camacho Mariurta, we want to focus first on critical loads, severely damaged infrastructure, and vulnerable community lifelines. We looked at it together. We didn't look at each one, but understand your question. And I'm looking around to which of my colleagues is going to be talking about this, because Mr. Wilbers will address that. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Camacho. It's Daryl Wilbers Luma. One of the ways we did this was on the distribution line feeder prioritization. We looked at worst performing, plus we looked at criticality. So in the criticality assessment, we used PREPA information that was submitted to the Siemens for use in the Siemens IRP. We also use that same data in our own assessment. So, for example, there was critical loads that were identified on each feeder. So we'd look at police stations, or we'd look at hospitals. We looked at airports and seaports. We gave it a critical rating for the type of customer, and we were able to aggregate it depending on the number of customers on that feeder. So by and large, then we were able to come up with a rating factor on every distribution feeder. And that we used with our prioritization with worst performing plus critical rating, critical customer rating. We were able to come up with an overall rating factor. That was one way. Does that answer your question?
Mr. Camacho, if I might add something here, I think it might be useful to Lee Wood. I think it might be useful to distinguish between prioritization and sequencing of a program versus prioritization and sequencing of individual project sites. The recovery and transformation framework was used to prioritize programs, high-level programs. And to give you an example, using this particular objective you pointed out, restore damaged critical infrastructure, the way we would use that objective in the recovery and transformation program prioritization was we would review each program and ask the question, does this program enable us to restore damaged grid infrastructure? Does it directly or indirectly or not at all enable us to do that? And if the program as a whole if we can say, yes, it directly and strongly impacts our ability to restore damaged infrastructure, then it would receive a 2 or a 3 in our qualitative scale. And so that's how that information would feed into those program prioritization ratings. There's another step later down the road that is, so now we have this program that we've determined is highly valuable, that's going to restore damaged infrastructure. So now that we have that program, which projects are most important to begin first within that program? Which sites, which assets, and so on. And at that level, that's where we would begin to consider critical loads, damaged infrastructure, and vulnerable community lifelines in terms of prioritizing and sequencing specific projects or assets within that program. I hope that helps to clarify the difference between programs versus individual assets or project sites, if you will.
So will you say that system stability on the island is a big issue in regards to properly serving PREPA's customers?
Hi, Mr. Camacho, Mario Hurtado. Yeah, I guess one thing I think the simple answer is yes. I think when you're referring to system stability in terms of how we looked at it, I mean, I think it has to do with reliability. There's an element of resiliency to it as well, but basically it's the ability, or I'll tell you what my interpretation is. It's the ability of the system to continue to provide service without major interruption, and go despite contingencies or events that might affect operating parameters or other system characteristics.
It will be
important.
Right. When we compare it to the mainland, mainland systems tend to be able to resist disturbances better than we can resist disturbances on the island in regards to the lack of inertia when compared to mainland systems. And what we're trying to get at is, if this is something that is high impact in order to better serve the customers on the island. How is that prioritized in your process? How do you take that into account when you're prioritizing?
Thank you for your question.
Mr. Camacho, this is Don Cortez. We took that into account when we look at system stability. Again, I keep coming back to the EMS. That's one of those foundational elements to help stabilize the system because of the information that's coming in and how fast you can process that information. So when we looked at from a stability perspective, and we were excluding generation projects because this is the Luma T&D system, we felt that the EMS is one of those that is high priority for stabilization. And we had other projects like the SCADA, for example. The faster information we get back to the EMS and the more information we get back to the EMS is highly critical for stabilizing the system. And we also try to segment as much of the damage on the circuit as possible at the lowest level to try to prevent large loads taking the system down. For example, the system-wide area protection that we're doing, trying to prevent cascading loads, cascading outages. So some of those are the things we're doing that will work towards stabilizing the system.
Thank you, Mr. Cortez. So I believe Mr. Wilbur had indicated that he may have gotten information from PREPA in regards to what a critical load or critical infrastructure will be. Is that correct? I just want to make sure that.
Hello, Mr. Camacho. Yes, it's Daryl here. That is correct. We got that information from PREPA, who advised us that this was the same information that they passed on to Siemens for the IRP, and it was the critical customer information that was provided to us on a per feeder basis.
On a per feeder basis. Do you know if that list? Yeah, please go ahead.
There's also the process that Mr. Tansi described in working through the restoration annex in the ERP, which was to look at the critical loads and identify them based on community lifelines and that scoring that he talked about. So that was a bottom-up process that we did using a list, but also looking specifically at the particular loads. I just want to make sure that the two weren't confused.
Right. So can you provide the difference between? So can you describe what will be a critical load and a vulnerable community lifeline?
Sure. We can certainly do that in a second.
Hi, Mr. Camacho. This is Rachel Engel with IEM. When we talk about community lifelines, the simple definition is that a lifeline is what enables the continuous operation of critical business and government functions, and it's essential to human health and safety and economic security. So through the lifelines, examples of those are health services such as hospitals and emergency medical services, utilities, military bases, airports. Those things tie into the lifeline of health and safety. So the facility itself is what becomes a critical facility, which is then categorized into 3 levels and included in critical loads. And I'll let Mr. Tansi go into a little more detail on the definition of a critical load.
Thanks, Rachel. Just going to pull up a document here, so have patience, please. So Terry Tansi. So a little more detail on the critical loads. Oh, I'm struggling to find my document. My mistake, guys.
Maybe while you're searching for that document, let me pose a different question while you're doing that.
Thank you,
So
Mr.
Act 17 2019 actually spells out what is called installations of indispensable services. Do we know if what you're deeming critical load is consistent with Act 17 2019?
To my knowledge, it is, yes. I mean, indispensable installations is the sort of thing that Ms. Engel was talking about. Hospitals. It seems very similar to me to a critical lifeline, something that's that sustains the community and protects life or property.
Talks also about water treatment facilities.
Those are included.
So the answer is that what you're deeming critical load is consistent with Act 17 2019 as is described on that article.
As far as I know, based on what I know about our work on critical loads and Act 17, yes.
Okay.
I'm going to check in here with Mr. Tansi and see if he's ready to give you that information.
The reason, sorry, Terry Thompson here again, and the reason I'm struggling to find it is we did not determine the critical loads in the plan. They are considered, as Rachel described, critical facilities.
Right. I think the term that some have used is critical infrastructure, right? But then what we're trying to determine is that list, you develop that list, or is that list coming from PREPA or FEMA, or where is that list coming from?
So the critical feeder list, Terry Tonsi again, thank you for the question. That came from PREPA. We got that information from the T&D folks. So they provided us a list per area, and then we made sure it aligned with the community lifelines to make sure it was true. And I say there's still work in progress, but we made sure it was aligned to the community lifelines. And now the community lifelines, and Rachel can clarify on this, those lists are what we got from FEMA. That was what FEMA designated as community lifelines. So we had to follow that to be FEMA compliant.
Yes, in 2019, FEMA issued new guidance and updated the National Response Framework to identify 7 community lifelines to which each organization, whether it's a government or non-governmental agency or private sector company, should frame all of their response and restoration and recovery operations around these 7 lifelines. Once we are able to successfully restore each lifeline, the community, the island will be successfully restored and go through the recovery from a disaster, any type of emergency. So for the 7 lifelines, we identify safety and security, food, water, shelter, health and medical, energy, which includes power and fuel, communications, transportation, and hazardous materials. Within the ERP in the base plan, we have included all of these lifelines, and we have done an analysis of each lifeline and identified what the risks or vulnerabilities are for the island and for LUMA, particularly when we talk about power and restoration. And so through that process, We also identified 3 different levels of critical facilities that feed into those lifelines, also identified as critical infrastructure. The actual names of each facility and those types of things are what we consider to be protected information, where in the wrong hands could be detrimental to the island. So that information is redacted. However, the types of facilities are not. And that's what we also have identified in the ERP, and I can go into detail on those if you'd like.
Yeah, so what we're trying to reconcile is that that identification is consistent with the article in Act 17, 2019, because the article states very explicitly the categories of these facilities, and it also states that is the Bureau, the one that could change these could include installations that have been identified. We just want to make sure that this is reconciled, that the question was posed to Mr. Hurtado, and he indicated that the facilities that have been identified are consistent with the Act. So I think at this point we are good on that one. So let me one more on Appendix B, and that will be page the second page, sustainable energy transformation. And we do not see an objective in regards to deployment of federal funding for sustainable energy transformation. Can you describe why that's not the case?
Actually, Director Regulatory. So these aren't mutually exclusive. So programs can both have deployment of federally funded and sustainable energy transformation. So if a program was able to use federally funded or federal funds, as well as achieve the goal of sustainable energy transformation, then those would both be checked off. So you could see a program where it would be able to deploy federal funds, which is under the system rebuild and resiliency, and then it would also be checked off under sustainable energy, one of the objectives under sustainable energy transformation. So, and you'll see that we prioritize those that had multiple benefits across multiple goals. So if it did check off both federally funded, some restoration, as well as energy transformation, then that would be a cumulative benefit that we put into our prioritization.
Thank you. Maybe this is for Mr. Wilbers or Mr. Cortez. Are you familiar with the way that PREPA classifies feeders, balance, priority, and critical?
Hello, Mr. Camacho. Thank you for the question. This is Daryl. No, I do not personally know how PREPA have prioritized or defined criticality as it pertains to their feeders. I can do an undertaking to get that information for you.
But Mr. Camacho, this is Don Cortez. I just want to add, when we plan for a circuit, we have planned and taken into account the number of critical customers on the circuit. We'll take into account the loading and the reliability for that circuit. So our planning takes into account the elements necessary for load connections to other substations. It'll take into account the rudimentary initially, but rudimentary will be the number of renewables that are on that circuit. So we'll take into account all the basic elements that you need for feeder planning.
Yeah, again, just trying to gauge your prioritization. So very high level without identifying facilities. PREPA may classify a critical feeder that is serving a hospital. And they may classify another feeder as a priority that may be supplying a large mall. is that your line of thinking also, to use that kind of classification moving forward, or are you thinking of other kind of classification?
May I ask Mr. Camacho, this matter, can I ask for what purpose that classification you would like? Give us an example of what we would be using that classification for.
That will depend up to you. I mean, yeah, you could use it to prioritize investments, prioritize reliability enhancement programs. The question is if that is something that you think it will be appropriate, that's something that you plan on doing.
Mr. Camacho, this is Dr. Cortez. When we do the planning, we're going to be applying the federal funding for bringing lines up to the new design standard, we will be looking at all of those feeders and circuits. Initially, we're going to start with the worst performing circuits because those are the customers in the system that are getting the worst service. As we're moving through, we're going to move then and move on to the customers that are getting better service that are on the list. For example, you might have a mall that is getting very good service today. So we will plan and bring those circuits up to our design standard. But we want to start with those customers that today are getting the worst service.
Thank you. And one last question, and then we can proceed to the next one. This is what kind of lingering. And this probably will be for Mr. Wilbers. This is again into a specific proposed project. This is line 5400. When you read the scope, it's interesting. The scope reads, it starts, the scope of work will, it seems like is on the future tense, and it says consists of repair of damaged elements to the overhead portion of the line and different things. Section 4 of that statement of work is codes and standards, but those codes and standards for that specific project is not specified. Can you describe the codes and standards that will govern these rebuilds, hardening projects?
And just for clarification, so this is a transmission line 50. I'm sorry, I don't.
Yeah, let me go. Yeah, let me go back. This is the proposed statement of work in regards of the PA funding, DR 4339, and this is a transmission line 5400 project that starts in Nahuabo, Punta Lima, Vieques, Culebra.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm just going to say that the typical codes and standards that we would typically use that I would reference to is the RUS standards. We've used that. So for the substation standards, we typically use 1724E 300, and that's for all T&D substations. It's not just distribution type substations. But our equipment ratings in that and substations would be the IEEE C37 and C57. Of course, there's our National Electrical Code and Safety Code, NEC, and NESC 2, C2, and NEC. So those are the typical industry standards that we would be using for that project. And that's, I have to say that I think we talked about it before. They tend to be minimum requirements to set the thresholds that would be used by a prudent utility. We have our own LUMA design standards, and we will be taking those I guess industrial and utility type standards, those consensus-based standards, and we'll be utilizing it and referencing it to come up with our LUMA design standards. And in that will also include resiliency measures, as we discussed on the distribution line and transmission line, where we're going to have composite poles on distribution lines, where we would have, anti-theft grounding perhaps in substations. So there will be enhancements to those design standards that go above and beyond the minimum standards in those industry type standards.
So, Mr. Wilbers, if I want to see LUMA's transmission planning guidelines, do you have that document somewhere?
The transmission planning guidelines, that's, I think something we've discussed before in previous hearings. We are looking at being compliant with the NERC TPL 001-4. That's something that we want to develop. We reviewed it in a fair amount of detail. There's nothing in that the NERC planning standards that we have any real issues. There are some things that we wouldn't need to be compliant to. I think there's some references above 300 kV type equipment. That's not obviously something that is necessary for the island. There might be some other elements within that NERC standard, but by and large, the annual reporting and the contingency planning for steady state and contingencies, that's something that we're going to be wanting to do. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So at this point, for that specific SOW, what we're hearing is that you may have your own LUMA's require standards that will be consistent with your transmission planning guidelines. And then that section of the SOW right now is kind of unknown or somewhat known. So the question is, if you look at that SOW, there are cost estimates associated with that project. So are those cost estimates buried when those codes and standards are identified?
This is Margarita Mercado for the record. I appreciate the question, and I think Mr. Camacho is referencing a particular document that is not in this record. Mr. Wilbur is answering because he's familiar with the document and is familiar with the work. But I want to state for the record that for a precise answer and fruitful discussion, the document should be reviewed, and it's outside the scope of the SRP that was filed in this record. I think Mr. Cortez that will be my objection or statement for the record for clarity.
Not an objection, just
No,
an expansion Mr. Camacho, Dr. Lopez. We have been working, I think I may have mentioned this before, we have been working alongside Sergeant Lundy, archiving all the standards. So we have been working on all the standards that are necessary for the work that we see coming down the line. And we have made tremendous progress on reviewing and updating standards that are necessary for us to perform work.
The ultimate standards, well, you as the T&D operator will decide on what will be those standards that will apply in Puerto Rico to run the T&D system. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so FEMA may have some requirements, yours may be more stringent.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, so that's for me for this section. If there are any commissioners that would like to pose questions, please go ahead.
No questions from our part.
From my part.
Okay, not there being any other questions from commissioners at this point, we are going to go ahead into the next topic on the agenda, which is control center updates and critical path.
Thank you, Mr. Akron. Roger Schiffman, consultant to the Bureau. I'm aware Ms. Mercado will remind us that the filing here is confidential.
Yes, I'm not going to interrupt your question, substantive question. It's page 170 to 72. It's where the specifics of the program briefs is located. Thank you. Hopefully I don't have to interrupt much more on the topic.
Yeah, so I'll attempt to keep my questions at a high level, and please keep your responses at a high level. Really just trying to get a sense, again, tying the system remediation plan investments and initiatives that are focused on really not just the control area, but overall operation of the system, technology and IoT investments. Again, just to try to get a summary, again, at a high level of what those initiatives are, again, what the time frame is for those initiatives, and what we can anticipate in terms of remediation performance resulting from those spending initiatives. So, with that in mind, the first question is really if you could just describe at a high level what the current again gaps and capabilities are of the control center, what Luma has identified in its gap analysis that needs to occur to remediate, and then give us a sense of how that's been reflected in the system remediation plan, both in terms of processes and spending initiatives, again, at a high level.
Stephen, this is Don Cortez. You're right, we're going to keep it at high level, and I'm going to ask Rafael Janek to start some comments.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schiffman, Rafael Janek, Manager of System Operation. I'll try to keep this as high level as possible. So we did a gap assessment, so no different than other area of Luma. We started with a gap assessment. We identified a gap, identify which gap are more severe than others, and following that, identify initiatives, programs to close these gaps. At a high level, I say the system that, for example, the EMS system that's currently deployed, the product that has reached its end of life and is, I would say, suitable to operate the current system, but definitely not suitable to start integrating new technology, really high level of renewables, mini grids, microgrids, all of that. There's some other aspect around the facilities themselves, so the control center. As you can imagine, these buildings or infrastructure house critical equipment. In some areas, the buildings have fallen in I would say, a state of disrepair that needs to be addressed promptly. We work with PREPA trying to understand the process that they utilize for, within the control center, how they would dispatch energy, how they would do switching, for example, managing their permits and all that. They have, I would qualify that the institutional knowledge. But when we requested, drafted or documented procedure, we were not able to see any of that. So that, I would say, at a high level, are assessments from the gap. So from there, we define, really tied to the control center, initiative. I would try to, I would describe them on a step-by-step approach and how they flow together, and I also try to link it with other initiative within Luma that will support or be foundational to some of that work. So we have I would say, two time horizon to address here. We have the imminent, for day one, for commencement, what we need in place to be ready, and to continue running with the current infrastructure, if you will. And also in parallel to that, how we transform and how we improve the situation. So we have, I will start with the immediate step or imminent step where we're currently doing. So we have interviewed and sat with current operators. We have documented the procedures. We have identified all the procedures. We have identified a lot of procedures that we believe are required for operating the system properly. Some of those procedures are more critical than others. Some might be more ad hoc type of procedure or reference more than anything else. We have undertaken to develop critical ones for day one. That will allow us to train operators. What we've seen so far, they follow some procedures, but all of them, depending on who's working, it's slightly different in how they do things. So what we want to start standardizing the assets of the current situation. Okay, so that will give us a good baseline to start. We're training the operator on that, and as we go, having an iterative process of continuous improvements. So defining all of that is a critical item because it's going to feed or it's going to lead to other initiative that I will talk in a second here. Other part of our initiative that we want to do and then we will do right away in the next few months is within the EMS. There are some, even if I mentioned it's past the end of life, there's some advanced application, advanced tool like a state estimator and security analysis type of tools that have not really been implemented or utilized by the operators in the past. They're currently not functional, but close to from what we have seen. So we want to bring them up to a level where they can be utilized and be an helpful tool to make real-time decision. That will become very critical as you've heard my colleagues before. We're going to start doing a lot of investment on the system, a lot of work in the field. To do that will require lots of outages, probably to a scale that PREPA has never seen. So we will have to get these tools up and running to do proper assessment for allowing outages of the system, to perform work in the field. So this is a critical part of what program we want to do. We will also develop a operator training program. We believe at LUMA that training our people, maintaining their skills sharp at all time, and continuously improving their ability is a critical requirement to operate a business. So that will become an important initiative also. I mentioned procedures earlier. That will feed in the development of the operator training program that we will develop. And the timing for all that is the first year, which will extend also in the second year, depending on the progress we're making. But we're targeting to have that in 12 to 18 month horizon. As this is moving forward, these will lay some of the foundational work to, I would say, bring our expertise level to a higher level. That information that we have collected so far, that we're working on, will also help us to our next two initiatives. One is the EMS replacement.
Yes.
And the other one tied to the EMS replacement in a sequence of events, if you will, is getting new infrastructure to help the control center and all the technology behind it. As I mentioned earlier, we're in clear need of a new facility for control center. For the EMS, we're currently in the process of developing all the business requirements. And all these business requirements, for example, or not for example, but they will follow. Just bear with me a second here. So they will follow, obviously, what our procedures, what the type of equipment we have. I will address generation resources, will address transmission resources, and the reactive resources we have. It's going to take into account demand resource balancing, system frequency needs around controlling that, system operating limits, emergency response, system planning. So many function in that in the new AMS. So that's the business requirement process collection. We're also looking in that to how this is going to integrate with our system, with OMS, for example, and other type of system. Part of the EMS also, we have defined which type of advanced application we want to have in there to, again, help making better decision on a real-time basis. Things around how we're gonna do our alarming policies and managing them, automatic generation control, reserve programs, state estimator, real-time contingency analysis, and the kind of study tools and stability tools. Load shedding program that can be updated, easily. Highlanding management, potentially also linking to mini-grid, microgrid operations. So all of that stuff is part of the business requirements we're currently gathering for the EMS. The timeline for the EMS, we're aiming for 36, or actually, worst case, we're aiming for 36 months. We're trying to get it done a little bit earlier. That's why we started this project, or the business gathering of requirement, I would say, sooner than we originally anticipated. What else can I say on the EMS at a high level? In parallel to that, I was mentioning control centers in the sense of building or housing facilities. Regarding that, we are also in the process of gathering requirements, things such as space, things such as, what facilities or what, excuse me, what the requirement will be in there around the, control room for transmission, generation, distribution, what this is going to look like, how much space we need, looking at, visitor gallery type of things. Rooms in there are state-of-the-art, meet cybersecurity, all type of requirements around that. So we're developing, high-level specification for the building. We're looking at siting. Where are we going to put that? Those buildings, I will. And in siting, it's not necessarily an easy task, given the requirement for those kinds of facilities. So you want it to be ideally secure. You want to have easy access or reliable access to power. If you can get multiple circuits feeder from different feeder, it's a plus. You need to have access to telecom infrastructure. You don't want to be in a flood zone. So there's really requirements around that are, I'd say, more stringent than potentially for other type of facilities. So we're looking at that part. As part of that, we're going to follow some standards around that. I was mentioning security. We're going to try to stick to the SIP 006 and 014. I want to mention they are NERC standard. At this point, as you aware, the system here is not under the NERC's jurisdiction. That being said, NERC has pretty decent standards. actually more than decent. They're industry best practice type of standards. So what we're doing is we're sort of cherry picking in those standards because not everything applies to here. And the thing that applies that had values, we're jumping on that. We're also, obviously following the Puerto Rico Building, Energy, Fire, Electrical, Mechanical, and Plumbing Codes, ISO 11064. That's a international standard for ergonomic design for control rooms. So we have identified some standards we're going to follow for that also. We will be aiming a USG BC LEED certification, hopefully targeting the platinum level, and meeting Uptime Institute tier rating system of a tier 3. So making sure that the downtime on those facilities are going to be close to 0. So that gives, I would say, a quick overview of the control centers themselves, some of the procedures related to that. We have other initiative around technology, IT/OT, telecommunication, for example, that will also be foundational to allow the amount of traffic and information that's going to start to be collected and feeding the new EMS. Mr. Wilbers talked about some of other programs. Part of that will be replacing RTUs and SCADA in the field to provide more visibility and data acquisition that will ultimately roll up to the control centers. At this point, I would quickly pass it to Mr. Badenhorst just to support a little bit complementary initiative on the communication side or OT/IT technology.
Yeah, Mr. Jorge Camacho, consultant for the prep. Mr. Iñat, before we pass, I think you mentioned NERC standards.
Yes.
Can you describe SRP initiatives designed to attain cybersecurity compliance with NERC SIP requirements? At a high level, we don't need to know exactly what it is, but we want to know if there are any SRP initiatives identified to attain that compliance.
Mr. Camacho, thank you for your question. Are you referring for the existing facility or the new facility?
Moving forward, so what will it be done right now? Will it be an SRP activity initiative?
So going forward on the for the new control center, if I may, that will be included in the project itself in the rebuild. For current situation or for going forward on day one, I will let Mr. Badenhorst answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Gignac. Commissioners, yes. So there's a few items that's foundational, I guess, to answer your question, and then I'll get into some of the details. There's SRP items in there that'll help us get closer to a NERC SIP compliant like standard. It's not going to happen overnight, of course. There's too many things that we have to still fix and figure out. But we do have a very solid cybersecurity plan that's in place right now. So we'll be working with some of the SRP funding to start getting some of those systems. And, like network segmentation is a good example. We need to start doing that in a better way. That's just one example of what needs to get done. Did that answer your question?
And those are part of current SRP proposed initiatives, correct?
Correct, yes.
Mr. Camacho, just to clarify, it would be the IT/OT cybersecurity program found on page 259 of the SRP filing. In particular, I know there's other places, but that would be the main one. I believe most of it is confidential.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Engel. So, Mr. Camacho, commissioners, just to kind of just elaborate a little bit on what Mr. Gignac was talking about is the EMS system as an example from an OT/IT perspective, the databases, the operating systems, are all out of date, not patchable anymore. The hardware is failing. They've actually got sparing that's many, many years old that's sitting on shelves just in case because you can't find parts anymore. So it's a little bit of a risk on that side too. The protocols they utilize to get the data from the field devices is a legacy serial type protocols, which is it limits routability, route diversity. So we can't, if a circuit goes down to a substation, it's very difficult to get that substation back online because there's no communication to that site that's automatically routed. The protocols, like I suggested, it's not only that it's serial and legacy, but it's also slow. It does not support high speed data transmissions. So it's very limited in its capabilities. And I think then that brings me to the foundational piece of tying all this stuff together. I know this is confidential, so we're going to be keeping it at a high level. So the telecoms backbone side of it is really key. What I can say is there's about 14 out of 56 fiber sections on the OPGW that is out of service that we need to get back in. And as we expand out and put new RTUs and substations and start doing AMI and start doing distribution automation, it is absolutely crucial that we have the backbone to support the data because the volume of data required is exponentially more than what they have today and the capacity that's available today. And maybe one last thing that I can mention is, we did talk about the NERC SIP. So we are definitely looking at utilizing the backbone to also support a lot of the NERC SIP initiatives. As you can imagine, there's a lot that goes around like monitoring, controlling, and segmentation on that side too. At the substation level as well as at the control center level. Maybe to take it one step further, like Mr. Gignac mentioned, there's definitely a better need for us to integrate the systems like OMS into the EMS system, which today it is done to a certain extent, but it's very islanded in some cases. Not all the information is necessarily shared between the two systems to give the operators all the information they need to make proper decisions.
Okay, thank you. Could you help me understand, there's a lot of talk about, the inspection process and the fact that we don't know, everything we need to know about what the current system configuration is, how that sort of lack of quality information interacts with the rollout of a new EMS system. Are those two related, or is it that the EMS has its own equipment that it's monitoring?
Mr. Shipman, this is Don Cortez. The transmission grid is pretty well documented and mapped all the way down to the substations, so that is not really an issue. The issue that we have identified and from a maps perspective is on the distribution side. So from an EMS perspective, it won't impact it that much, but the plans are to go ahead and try to get the primary lines and maps identified and corrected shortly after takeover. At least to know where the open points are for the distribution system.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cortez. And then, as I understood, there's a number of the existing generators that have AGC capability installed but not operational. How does that interact with both the current EMS system and the new system? What's the plan to attack and take advantage of the AGC capability that currently is installed physically but not operable?
Yes, Mr. Shipman, thank you for your question. So I would say two aspects of it. One is that the EMS side of things. So the current function or algorithm in the AGC hasn't been reviewed in a while. and its performance is okay, but we believe it can be improved by reviewing algorithms and all that. Definitely, the new EMS will, help us fine tune that. The expertise at PREPA to do that on the current EMS is no longer. So they're basically having a system and utilizing it, and not necessarily having the skills to let's call it tune the AGC. So as we go through the transformation, this is something that we will take into consideration in improving on that side. On the other side, on the plant side, I know we discussed that a little bit in a previous hearing around the system operation principle. We will work closely, collaboratively with the plant owners to try to reestablish or reinstall these controls and bring them to an effective status. And that will definitely help regulation on the system.
Mr. Shipman, this is Mario Hurtado. So the program in more detail that Mr. Ginac was describing is on page 178. It's critical energy management and load generation balancing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hurtado. And then moving forward, as we get more, distributed resources connected, probably primarily at the distribution voltage level, how will that affect, again, the EMS rollout, and does again a lack of visibility on the underlying system, how will that, to the extent it does, how will that create obstacles or impede, the development and interconnection and operation of the distributed resources, and as we move more towards transformation and targeting compliance with the RPS requirements laid out in Act 17.
Yes, Mr. Shipman, this is Don Cortez. Let's start at the distribution level, because we are encouraging and with posting capacity, trying to get as much solar or renewable penetration on the distribution side. We recognize that we need tools. First of all, we need the systems, the distribution systems, to be able to carry load between one area and another area. So the distribution system itself needs to be fairly solid. And as we're rebuilding it, we're taking care of that level. For information purposes that we need, we're going to try to take advantage of as much as we can of the current SCADA that we have. And we're going to be installing telecommunications basically ahead of the EMS installation. So we also have plans for an ADMS and a DERMS system that at first will have a manual, you could say a manual interface with the EMS, because the system currently really can't automatically operate together. But we'll have a manual bridge to get information back and forth between the two systems. But we currently have in our budgets an ADMS and a DERMS to help us with the management of the growth spurt that we see and we hope to see and encourage on renewable resources. We're going to be installing, based on the telecommunications rollout, devices on the distribution grid. They'll help us monitor things like voltage and current to help us plan to increment the hosting capacity at the circuits that are currently at a lower limit, because we don't have that information. And I don't know, Mr. Wilbers, do you want to add anything to that? Okay.
And in terms of developing the system remediation plan efforts that you have put together, Mr. Cortez, are you forecasting some limitations in connecting renewables until these equipment are installed, or does the SRP reflect, what you think is adequate investment and timing to match, the targeted development and connection of RPS driven renewables?
The RPS driven renewables were not considered SRP items. However, the RPS will benefit from the SRP because it's fixing the underlying grid. So the underlying grid is going to be foundational to move energy among the distribution circuit. I would say a large part of that is included in the SRP.
Right. My question wasn't so much that the renewables were part of the SRP, but whether Luma believes that the SRP expenditures and any limitations on implementation, whether those are adequate to connect and integrate the level of renewables that are required under Act 17.
I would say that if we combine both the SRP work and the non-SRP work, both of those items will benefit and help us increase the hosting capacity on the distribution circuits.
And this is Mario Hurtado, and overall, those investments will support the meeting the RPS goals. Again, whether one particular circuit gets overloaded and can't take everything or a particular zone, I mean, that's going to be kind of dependent on topology and timing of the investment program. But overall, we've targeted the investments that we think are necessary in order to support meeting the RPS goals.
The items that we're going to install on the grid when we have communication are those items and monitors that'll keep us from creating over voltage in the circuit. That is one of our greatest concerns, of course, why we place limitations on hosting capacity so that we don't have an over voltage to other customers.
And just so I understand, the SRP investments are projected, on a consistent time frame with the RPS requirements that the system would be able to handle. Assuming that procurement and everything else moves forward as envisioned in Act 17, the system would be ready for that, or is there uncertainty surrounding that from Luma's standpoint?
Well, I'll start. So this is Mario Hurtado. I mean, I think we, as we discussed in our in the docket on the initial budgets, I mean, we put in as aggressive a capital layout program as we think can be executed, and obviously taking full advantage of the federal funding that's available. We think that's we will do everything we can to support those RPS goals. Whether it will exactly match the RPS growth depends on the pace of the on the generation side of the new generation sources that come in, whether they come in at the utility scale or predominantly at the distribution scale, and a number of other factors. So there's certainly uncertainty in how that is all going to play out, but we've taken care to put as aggressive an investment program in place in order to support the RPS goals.
The current work we're doing with the hosting capacity and communicating as much with the RPS installer vendors as possible. We want to keep that open dialogue. We will then get direct feedback as to whether there's a particular area that a vendor or installer believes needs to increase in hosting capacity. And from our planning perspective, we'll take that into account.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of the, again, with connecting those projects, in both the current data and systems analysis capability you have, could you talk as well, Mr. Cortez, just how interconnection studies fit into that overall process in terms of being able to understand, the system as new projects come in and being able to accommodate requests for interconnection and, targeting upgrades that are, not necessarily related to remediation or reconstruction from hurricane damage, but as well, upgrades that are needed to accommodate interconnection or delivery from particular projects?
Yes, I'll give you a brief overview and then I'm going to turn it over to Shay.
I'm not sure if others can, but I can't hear you, Mr. Cortez.
We model the results of this upcoming tranche of renewables.
Mr. Cortez, excuse me, could you please start again because we lost audio and we couldn't hear the first thing of your response. This is Vanessa Caro.
Yeah, I think our mic went out for a second.
Go ahead. Can you give us 5 minutes to?
Yeah, sure. You can take 5 minutes and we'll reconvene.
Okay, I think our audio batteries ran out.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those 5 minutes. We believe we fixed our audio problems. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. I'll start again then. So what we have, Mr. Schiff, and this is Don Cortez, is the system model now, and we are prepared to analyze the results of this current RFP that we will be receiving proposals on May the 28th. So we are prepared to analyze those, carry them through in 3 phases as was described in the RFP. So we have our people set up to do that. Once we receive those proposals and analyze them, we at the same time start preparing for tranche number 2. But we want to see the results of tranche number 1 before we actually formulate an RFP for tranche number 2. But we have the system model that we now are satisfied with and are ready to analyze the utility scale renewables that come in this RFP that's on the market.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the prepared questions I have in this area. I'm not sure if the commissioners or Mr. Camacho have any additional questions.
Commissioners, do you have any additional questions at this point?
No, I don't have additional questions regarding this topic. Thank you.
This is Commissioner Mateo. I have 2 general questions that I think it's convenient to ask at this time. After spending the day discussing this SRP and after hearing all the responses on whether something is in the SRP or it's outside of the SRP, etc. I have this general question. If a customer wants to be informed on the work to be performed for the remediation / repair and transformation of the grid, would any LUMA representatives be able to refer that person to a single document covering all the work?
Thank you for your question, Commissioner. This is Mario Hurtado. Yeah, all of the work is covered in the initial budgets, so that would be the single document. If we were to point them to just one document.
And do you think that the initial budget would be a document that, for the sake of transparency and a customer-centric system and company, would be easy to handle by a lay person rather than a technician or a regulator?
I'm sorry, Commissioner, I missed the first part of the question.
Would you think that the initial budgets filing is the type of document that a lay person, i.e. a non-technical or legal person, would be able to understand or manage to review easily?
Commissioner, I don't know. Hard for me to say personally. We certainly tried to write it in a way that was clear and to the point. There's certainly parts of it that are relatively technical, and obviously the explanation of rates and budget and so on are not necessarily going to be. Again, we attempted to make it as clear as possible to the layperson and use plain language. But I guess it would depend on the individual reader whether or not they found it could communicate what they wanted to get out of it. I think that, we're certainly quite interested in making sure that we are communicating clearly with stakeholders and with our customers. And, we plan to have communication tools to communicate what our plans are, in addition to the formal filings we make to the Energy Bureau. And I think, covering our plans and how we plan to move forward, and obviously how we plan to invest ratepayer dollars or dollars from the rate base as well as federal funds would be an important component of our communication efforts.
Let me then try to take a look at this from a different perspective. Do you think that as part of the transparency that LUMA wants to have in its operation of the system and the work that is going to be performed, do you think that there is a need for, even outside of the purview of these proceedings, but there is a need for a single place where a customer would find an explanation and a summary of the work to be performed in a way that would tell them all the benefits that they are going to receive in a non-technical matter?
Commissioner, yes, I would hope that once the plans are approved, then we will be able to make the appropriate summaries and be able to have the information that's for the public and on our website, and that they'd be able to go and look at that and find the information that they need. We've tried to make some specific efforts to communicate clearly. We did a presentation for these initial budgets as well as others at the front of our filings, but that's really just a small initial step. And I think engagement with our customers and with the public in general requires a lot more work to make sure that we're communicating clearly. So I do think we should be able to provide that on our website. That would be one of the channels. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Perfect. And my last question is, I've seen that all of the programs and the initiatives, or however we want to call them, they have a timeline and milestones. I just wanted to confirm that those timelines and milestones encompass the process to come before the Bureau for approval on capital investments. Is that building?
We are aware that we have to go in front of the Bureau, and we have assumed that we need to do that as part of moving forward with these programs. That's a big part of this process on the initial budgets. Additional approvals we know that is necessary for the expenditure of the capital with the federal funding. We look forward to any other processes, and we'll work through them as expeditiously as we can to make the timeline that we've set out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hurtado. Engineer Acaron, I don't have any other questions at this moment.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Mateo. Any other questions from commissioners?
Not from my part.
All right, thank you. So I have a few housekeeping matters on requests that were made during the day. Commissioners and consultants, please feel free to clarify. I have for NUMA to provide the documents related to the RFP that was done for the task of the billing and printing and outsourcing, and any information on the savings related to using other vendors. And also I have for NUMA to provide a categorization of the initiatives instead of programs by SRP and non-SRP. That's all I have for the moment.
This is Margarita Mercado for the record. We have a clarification whenever the Bureau so allows before we close the record.
Yes, please proceed, Attorney Mercado.
So Ms. Ashley Englund will provide a clarification with Lee from the Bureau.
Thank you. Ashley Englund. So this is with respect to the distribution line rebuild discussion and the SRP. So on page 82 of the SRP filing, under program description form, circuit voltage conversions to improve distribution capacity is a non-SRP item. Similarly, as described in the slides, I believe on slide 37 and on 38 of the presentation today, the asset level programs are viewed or either categorized as SRP or non-SRP based on the impact or consequence of that program. And then further, as inspections occur, if individual assets will be deemed or evaluated with a health score of 0 or 1, the activities to remediate those assets that are a 0 or a 1 will be an SRP activity, whereas if the assets are not deemed to be a 0 or a 1, the activity to make improvements to it or modernize it are not considered an SRP activity. And so that's kind of how those are delineated within asset programs. So for the line rebuild, if there is a decision to, or if there is, assets that are 0 and 1, if that line is deemed to be a 0 or circuit to deemed to be a 0, then the replacement of that circuit would be part of the SRP. And so obviously what it is replaced with and what voltage would be considered. But independently if no assets were considered to be a 0 or a 1, and there was a voltage conversion proposed, or that would not be part of the SRP. Lastly, on the SRP is again delineating those activities that are remediating high-risk assets or activities. They don't factor into the prioritization of the work or the funding of the work.
Ms. Sacaron, this is Jorge Camacho. Could we follow up on that?
Yes.
So, thank you so much, Ms. Englund. Can we go to page 87 on the distribution line rebuild? And we just want to, so those distribution cable replacement, underground feeder replacement upgrades, what are those initiatives? Are those SRP initiatives or?
So it depends if the cable has been assessed as a 0 or a 1 as it has been inspected. So if the cable is a 3, then it wouldn't be. If the cable is a 2, then it wouldn't be. It would be dependent on the quality or the health condition of the cable prior to the replacement.
Okay, thank you much.
Thank you. Attorney Mercado, are there any other clarifications or housekeeping matters?
Margarita Mercado, for the record, I believe that those were the clarifications, and we thank the Bureau for the opportunity to file them for the record.
Thank you. So I want to thank everyone for your participation during the day, and we are going to close the technical conference today, May 14, 2021 at 5:24 p.m. Thanks everyone again, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.